Okay, we're going to talk about controlling the bureaucracy. I don't know if I like the word controlling, but we'll go with it. Anything as large and powerful as the federal bureaucracy requires watching. Both the president and Congress have responsibility for making the bureaucracy responsive to elected officials and presumably the public, because we elected them. And both have a set of tools for and challenges in doing so. So we'll start with the president. And we've talked about this before. Presidents try hard, not always with success, to impose their policy preferences on agencies. Following are some of their tactics. Appoint the right people to head the agencies. Of course, the right people according to them. That doesn't mean the other side likes them. Normally, presidents control the appointments of agency heads and subheads. Putting their people in charge is one good way for presidents to influence agency policy. The president does not have a completely free hand, however. Clinton had no use for his FBI director, Louis Freeh, who I think that's his name, who would barely talk to him, but he did not fire him for fear of being denounced as purging an enemy. And as you can see, I think that's a good example where Trump has broke with tradition. He had no problem telling people to leave and firing people if he didn't see them as being in line with him or loyal to him. Traditionally, though, in the past, people would take note of that negatively. Okay, issue orders. Now, this one I'm going to talk about also in class. It's a big deal. You'll hear about them in the media. Presidents can issue executive orders to agencies. These orders carry the force of law and are used to implement statutes. Remember, statutes are written law by legislature. Statute. Common law is written by judges. Ordinances are local. So statute, legislative law. Treaties and provisions of the Constitution. For example, following the 9/11 attacks, Bush issued executive orders creating a new cabinet position to coordinate Homeland Security and a Homeland Security Council authorizing the secretaries of the Navy, Army, and Air Force to call up reservists for active duty, lifting a ban on the CIA engaging in political assassination, and establishing military tribunals to try terrorists. At other times, the White House uses other means of signaling that the president wants something done. The president's rhetoric, so speeches and talk, in speeches outside the bureaucracy may also influence the priorities of bureaucrats. So what Trump tweeted might influence or would have influenced them. Nevertheless, presidential directives are not always implemented. Agency heads may push back out of fear of running afoul of Congress or the press. Moreover, interest groups try to influence policy implementation and also heavily lobby the White House's Office of Management and Budget's review of proposed agency regulations to attempt to influence their content. I would also add lawsuits. When those executive orders start coming out, either side, someone starts suing. There starts to be lawsuits about them. We can talk about that in class. Alter an agency's budget. The Office of Management and Budget is the president's own final authority on the agency's budget. The OMB's threats to cut here or add there will usually get an agency's attention. Each agency, however, has its constituents within and outside of Congress, and Congress, not the president, does the appropriating, handing out the money. So I'm not sure how Biden's is working out right now, but with Trump's, he cut a lot of stuff. And for example, Great Lakes, some Great Lakes initiative, and then Republicans Upton and Huizenga, as well as I'm sure Democrats, our senators were like, no, you're not cutting that. We want that money in working for the Great Lakes, and so they put it back in the budget. So he was adamant about trying to cut some of these programs, and Congress people put them back in. So when you see in the media, this president has just slashed this budget, don't assume that it's going to follow through with that. Congress is the ultimate decider on whether or not that money is going to be in the budget. Although obviously the president can veto. It's usually not in his best interest to veto, spending. Then you end up with the government shutdowns, and that's a whole other story. Okay, reorganizing an agency. Although Reagan promised, proposed, and pressured to departments of energy and education, he never succeeded, largely because each department was in the hands of an entrenched bureaucracy backed by elements in Congress and strong constituent groups that, have a vested interest in it. Reorganizing an agency is hard to do if it is a large and strong agency, and reorganizing a small and weak agency is often not worth the trouble. Nevertheless, as we saw, a massive reorganization occurred in 2002 with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. Okay, Congress now. So I would definitely say the two biggest, most important ways the president controls the bureaucracy or has his hand in it is who he chooses and executive orders. These two. This one ends up usually not being the case. And then this one, again, that's really not where you're going to put a lot of your energy in, especially if you might only be there 4 years or even 8. Okay. So Congress what does Congress do? Congress exhibits a paradoxical relationship with the bureaucracies. On the one hand, as we've seen, members of Congress may find a big bureaucracy congenial. Congenial meaning pleasant, or something that they want. So think of like congeniality, pleasant, agreeable. Big government provides services to constituents who may show their appreciation at the polls. Moreover, when Congress lacks the answers to policy problems, it hopes the bureaucracies will find them. Unable itself, for example, to resolve the touchy issue of equality in intercollegiate athletics, Congress passed the ball to the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Unable to decide how to make workplaces safer, Congress produced OSHA. Congress is typically the problem-identifying branch of government, setting the bureaucratic agenda, but letting the agencies decide how to implement the goals it sets. By the way, if they let the agencies decide or the president decide, then they can shrug their shoulders and say, I didn't do it. It's not our fault. Plus, when you have 535 people in Congress, it's hard to make a change, to shift in decisions. So they don't change much of it. Okay. On the other hand, Congress has found it challenging to control the government it had helped create. There are several measures Congress can take to oversee it. Okay. Influence the appointments of agency heads. Even when the law does not require senatorial approval of a presidential appointment, members of Congress are not shy in offering their opinions about who should and should not be running the agencies. When congressional approval is required, members are doubly influential. Committee hearings on proposed appointments are almost guaranteed to produce lively debates if some members find the nominees' probable orientations objectionable. And by the way, this has become just so much more politicized in the last few years. Democrats have a hard time wanting to push back against a Democrat's choice, and Republicans really have a hard time pushing back against a Republican's choice. So it's not really been a Congress versus the president. And if you have problems, but you're in the same party, people get a little taken aback if you voice your concerns with the president's choice if it's the same party. Okay, but again, Senate approves many appointments, and that is supposed to be a check on the president. Alter an agency's budget. When the congressional power of the purse comes a mighty weapon for controlling bureaucratic behavior. For example, cutting a budget will make it more difficult for an agency to regulate behavior. Congress can also pass limitation riders, which forbid agencies from spending money for specific purposes. At the same time, Congress knows that many agencies perform services that its constituents demand. Too much budget cutting may make an agency more responsive at the price of losing an interest group's support for a re-election campaign. Too much budget cutting, Congress can also order the bureaucracy to spend money in certain ways through detailed provisions and laws, or more informally through statements and reports on legislation. So this came up when building the wall. When Trump wanted to build the wall, he moved money from the defense budget. And whether or not that he could or should have, it was vague enough. Emergency orders, there's a lot the president can do. But then in the new one, they specified much more detail where money could and could not go when they did that next defense budget. Okay, so that's not, I don't know if that's really a pushback on bureaucracy, but it was a pushback on the president. Hold hearings. Committees and subcommittees can hold periodic hearings as part of their oversight responsibilities. And in these hearings, they may parade flagrant agency abuses of congressional intent in front of the press. However, the very committee that created a program usually has responsibility for oversight of it and thus has some stake in showing the agency in a favorable light. Furthermore, members of Congress have other disincentives for vigorous oversight, including a desire not to embarrass the chief executive. So if the president is a Democrat or Republican, if the House or the Senate is controlled by the opposite party, you're going to see more oversight. You're going to see more meetings. You're going to see more push. Hey, why are you doing this? Again, because it's become much more political, Republican, Democrat, the Democrats aren't really going to want to push very hard to do oversight over Biden's administration, and the Republicans did not want to do oversight over Trump's administration. What is the way around that? Media attention, and you and I as voters and constituents pushing back on our elected officials, Republican or Democrat. They do care if it shows up in the media a lot. They do care if they actually are getting feedback from their constituents. But another problem with that is constituents are becoming more and more entrenched on party lines, so they get defensive for the president. So if you're a Trump supporter, now Biden supporter, you might not want, you're telling them not to look into the issue because it's politicized. Go from there. So rewrite the legislation or make it more detailed. Congress can't overturn agency rules or limit an agency's authority to make them. In addition, every statute is filled with instructions to the administrators to limit bureaucratic discretion choices and make its instructions clearer. Congress can write new or more detailed legislation. Still, even voluminous detail can never eliminate discretion. This is a good example with immigration. Decades and decades we've wanted immigration changes, law change for immigration, but they're not doing it. They can't come to agreement. So you see the president steps in with his heads of bureaucracy, and he enforces the law, the immigration laws, the way he chooses through executive order and bureaucratic discretion, because Congress won't change the law. Okay, sometimes these efforts are detrimental to bureaucratic performance. In 2008, about 80 House and Senate committees and subcommittees claimed jurisdiction, the right to hear a case, over a portion of Homeland Security issues. Officials in the Department of Homeland Security have to spend a large percentage of their time testifying to these committees, and the balkanized jurisdiction has undermined the ability of Congress to perform comprehensive oversight. Moreover, different committees may send different signals to the same agency. One may press for stricter enforcement or regulations, for example, while another seeks more exemptions. Scholars have found that Congress is less influential in controlling the bureaucracy relative to the White House when more committees are involved in the effort. Okay, so the next topic here, iron triangles and issue networks. You should probably caught on by now that this is one of my favorite topics. It makes me sad. It's a very frustrating part of government. They try to argue it's not as bad as sometimes I see it, but maybe I'm being unfair. Go from there. Agencies' strong ties to interest groups on the one hand and to congressional committees and subcommittees on the other further complicate efforts to control the bureaucracy. So now we are finishing our triangle. We started with interest groups, congressional committees, they say subcommittees, and now we're at bureaucracy. There's our triangle. Got it? Okay. Bureaucracies often enjoy cozy relationships with interest groups and with committees or subcommittees of Congress. When agencies, groups, and committees all depend on one another and are in close, frequent contact, they form what are called iron triangles or sub-governments. Government under the government. Same thing as iron triangle. Just sounds cooler to say iron triangle. Triads that have been advantages for all sides. Remember the revolving door. Work for the bureaucracy, then turn around and work for the interest group. Work for the interest group, get hired into the bureaucracy as a head. Is usually you don't go from interest group to low level bureaucracy. You go from, an industry and then become a head of a bureaucracy or, pretty up there. Then go work for a Congress member, might not be an actual member of Congress here, but go work for them and then get hired into here. Like all of this, these are people and these people move through different groups. Thus, for example, a subcommittee on aging, senior citizens, Thus, for example, a subcommittee on aging, senior citizens interest group, which would be the AARP, and the Social Security Administration are likely to agree on the need for more Social Security benefits. Richard Redding has recounted how an alliance solely gelled around the issue of fighting cancer. It rested on three pillars: cancer researchers, agencies within the NIH, National Institutes of Health, and members of congressional health subcommittees. So if you're a member of Congress and you care about cancer and health, or health and part of it's cancer, you join the right subcommittee. You should know that from the Congress chapter, right? You join the committees that you're interested in. Well, you're a scientist and you care about health, and of course, cancer, a great place to go work is the NIH. They get grant money and they work on this stuff. And then, of course, the pressure then comes in from cancer institutes like, it's the American Cancer Society and others. And all three of these together all have the same goal: fighting cancer. So they can all push and get it done. And this might be a positive example if you believe the government should be involved in fighting different cancers. When these iron triangles shape policies for senior citizens, the fight against cancer, tobacco, or any other interest, officials in the different triangles make each policy independently of the others, sometimes even in contradiction to other policies. For example, I think I brought this one up in a previous reading. For years, the government supported tobacco farmers in various ways while encouraging people not to smoke. Moreover, the Iron Triangle's decisions tend to bind larger institutions such as Congress and the White House. Congress often defers to the decisions of committees and subcommittees, especially on less visible issues. You and I aren't paying attention. That's why it's important to have investigative journalism. The White House may be too busy wrestling with global concerns to fret. That's kind of, I don't know if fret's the right word, over agricultural issues or cancer. Emboldened by this lack of involvement, subgovernments flourish and add a strong decentralizing and fragmenting element to the policymaking process. This might be the 60 Minutes episode about opioids and how that operated under Obama and the Justice Department and all the other Congress people, voting for it. It was a sub-government, and most people were not really paying it. Most people in Congress and the White House and the Justice Department were not paying attention. Not an excuse, but an explanation. There is often a cozy relationship and even movement between components of the three sides of a sub-government. Revolving door. For example, in 2003, Congress added a massive prescription drug benefit under Medicare. Oh, I remember this. Representative Tausen shepherded the drug bill through the House as chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee. He then retired from Congress and to head the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, a powerful industry lobby group for an estimated $2 million a year. That was his income. Thomas Scully, the Medicare administrator and lead negotiator for the administration, resigned his position within weeks of the passage of the bill to join a lobbying firm that represented several healthcare industry companies significantly affected by the new law. He also announced he would be working part-time for an investment firm with an interest in several more companies affected by the new law. Okay, when this law was made, one of the arguments has always been that if the government can buy, if we have national health care or national programs, the government can make better deals with companies like prescription drug companies, just like they do in Canada and in countries in Europe. You can mass purchase products like cholesterol drugs, etc., and you can demand price cuts as a government agency. Well, in this law that moved the prescription drugs into Medicare, there was a portion that said that the federal government cannot negotiate prices. So they took what is arguably was the benefit, people argued, and took it out. It was not allowed. Since then, and there was an uproar on that, and people got a hold of that. But imagine the people writing the law, working with the interest group, wrote that law, and then went and worked for the companies that are now going to make money off the federal government paying for this stuff. And so Iron Triangles really make me sad and a little frustrated. But moving on, I don't know if that's true anymore. I think someone changed the rules on that, but I'd have to Google it. Maybe I will in class. In recent years, the system of sub-governments has become overlaid with an amorphous system of issue networks. These networks have led to more widespread participation in bureaucratic policymaking, including by many who have technical policy expertise and are drawn to issues because of intellectual or emotional commitments rather than material interests. Those concerned with environmental protection, for example, have challenged formerly closed sub-governments on numerous fronts. This opening of the policymaking process complicates the calculations and decreases the predictability of those involved in the stable and relatively narrow relations of sub-governments, which are iron triangles. Remember, same thing. Okay. Although sub-governments are often able to dominate policymaking for decades, they are not indestructible. For example, the sub-government pictured in 14.4 long dominated smoking and tobacco policy, focusing on crop subsidies and tobacco farmers. But increasingly, these policies came under fire from health authorities who were not involved in tobacco policymaking in earlier years. Similarly, Congress no longer considers pesticide policy, once dominated by chemical companies and agricultural interests, separately from environmental health concerns. Now, what they're not telling you here is that iron triangle over cigarettes and cigarette smoking lasted for decades, beyond us knowing cigarette smoking was bad for you. It's not like it happened within 6 months. It took decades to break that triangle. It took decades to turn government against smoking. It did not happen overnight, and it did not happen all overnight. It happened in increments. So it was arduous. I would argue it was arduous. That's my opinion. An especially vivid example of the death of the Iron Triangle is the case of nuclear power. During the 40s and 50s, Americans were convinced that the technology that had ended World War II would also serve peaceful purposes. Nuclear scientists spoke enthusiastically about harnessing the atom to achieve all sorts of goals, eventually making electricity so inexpensive that it would be too cheap to meter. Optimism and progress through science was the rule, and the federal government encouraged the development of nuclear power. Through a powerful iron triangle, I I'm going to have an opinion on that one. Congress established a special joint committee, the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, with complete control over questions of nuclear power. It also created a new executive agency, the AEC, the committee, the commission, the private companies that built nuclear power plants, and the electrical utilities that operated them together formed a powerful subgovernment. The U.S. built more nuclear power plants than any other country in the world. And American technology was exported overseas to dozens of nations. Nuclear power today, after the accidents of 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima, and the various cost overruns associated with the industry, bears almost no resemblance to nuclear power in the early 60s, when the Iron Triangle was at its peak. What happened? Before the 60s had ended, the experts had begun to lose control. When critics raised questions concerning the safety of the plants and weren't able to get local officials to question the policies publicly, the issue grew into a major political debate associated with the growth of environmentalism. Opposition to nuclear power destroyed two of the most powerful legs of the Iron Triangle. Congress disbanded the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy. A variety of congressional committees now claim some jurisdiction over nuclear power questions. Similarly, Congress replaced the AEC with two new agencies, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Department of Energy. The nuclear power industry was devastated. No new nuclear power plants were started in the U.S. for decades, and almost all those under construction at that time were abandoned at a huge financial loss. Nuclear power provides only about 9% of our total energy production, including about 1/5 of our electricity. In sum, the wave of environmental concern that developed in the 60s swept away one of the most powerful iron triangles in recent American history. This is not the end of the story, however. The extraordinarily high price of gasoline and heating fuel in much of this century and concerns about global warming have encouraged a reconsideration of nuclear power. Gallup poll has found, for example, that the majority of public supports the use of nuclear energy to produce electricity. It is not surprising that a new nuclear power plant opened in 2015 and several more are under construction in the U.S. If the nuclear power industry should revive, there will be renewed calls for strict regulation from both the bureaucracy and Congress. Whether an Iron Triangle reemerges will depend on where the public is attentive to the issue of nuclear power and whether it allows experts to define safety concerns as technical matters appropriate only for experts to decide. So again, are we paying attention? That's the best way to break an Iron Triangle is for regular Americans and people to pay attention, which usually often happens through either another interest group, an opposing interest group that is gathering information, gathering attention, going public, etc. from that chapter, or also from the other chapter, media and investigative journalism and media attention. Those are two ways to for us to break iron triangles. Okay. So every chapter, as you know, talks about the scope of government. This section is always there. And I'm going to let you read that, and we will be the end of this chapter.